Now, I really like BitWarden. It has been my password manager of choice since I quit LastPass, but I've always been using it through the browser extension because most of the time when I need to log into something, it's going to be done in the browser anyway, so it sort of just makes sense to use that extension. But there is also a CLI tool as well, and I hadn't really had a proper look at it until very recently. It's got some interesting design choices to say the least, but I think there's a base here that can be improved upon. Now, I'm not going to be using my main account today because honestly, I'm too lazy to censor it, and I know that if I do try to censor it, I'm probably going to make a mistake somewhere and leak all of my passwords. So instead of doing that, I've gone and made a burner account we're going to use instead. First thing we want to do is run bwlogin, and this will actually prompt you for your email and your password, so I'll cut back to when this is done. And give that a second, and it should successfully log in. Now that you're logged in, if you ever want to log out, all you need to do is run bwlogout, and that's pretty much it. Now that we're logged in, we should go and locally set our session key to make sure that we don't have to put our password in for every single action we're trying to do. So there's a couple of ways we can go and do that. We can either set the bw_session environment variable, or we can go and pass the session key along to every single command we want to run. Now, this form right here gets very long very quickly, so I'd recommend just going and setting the environment variable. So let's go and copy this one right here, run that command there, and then inside of this ZSH session, that key has now been set. Now, before we go and do anything else, we should go and synchronize our vault because BitWarden CLI doesn't actually constantly pull down from the BitWarden server. It actually maintains a copy locally on your system. So basically, it's running a local server for you to use. So let's go and run bw sync and give that a second. And there we go, now the syncing is complete. If you don't do that, you might have some changes that exist on the remote server that don't exist in your local copy. Okay, so get ready for the least well thought through CLI interface that has ever graced this planet. So let's go and make a new item. So you might think this is fairly straightforward. That's not the case, because there's not actually options to go and set things like the username and the password and the comments and things like that. You actually have to go and pass through a JSON object, and this JSON object has basically no documentation. It's not like, oh, it's just listed in the documentation and nothing's described. A lot of the things you can pass in with that JSON object are not listed, so unless you go and create something on the, I guess, web client and then try to copy what's already there, it's kind of difficult to work out what you can actually add inside of this object. Luckily for just adding a username and password, it's not super complicated, but if you want to go and add that extra stuff, I leave that up to you. Okay, so the first thing we need to do, even though there's no documentation for it, is find out what we can actually set. So if we go and run bw get template and then the template for an item, that is going to print out this right here. Now, you may notice that there's no username and password field here. We do have a login, and login is just set to null. So I didn't actually realize at the start what this had to be set to. What this actually has to be set to right here is a object, and that object needs to contain the keys username and password. Now, even though we could go and take this object and modify it ourselves, we may get the syntax a little bit wrong, and that will just break everything we're trying to do. So we're much better off using an application like JQ, which is a command line parser for JavaScript, and that's going to let us just modify all of the values inside of this object. So just to create a username and password, this is the full command that I'm going to be running. So bw get template item, and we're going to be piping that into JQ. So JQ is a separate application that you will not get with the BitWarden CLI. And what we're doing is we're setting the login property to equal this object right here. So username colon, and then we're going to set the username to test, and we're going to set the password to password. Then we're going to pipe that into bw encode, which is basically going to encode it into a 64-bit string, and then pipe that into bw create item, which will finally create the login inside of BitWarden. Now, while running this command has successfully worked, as we can see, we have a new item with just the name item name, because we didn't actually go and set a different name from the default. The name in here is this one right here, so item name. It's got the username test, and then the password, as we can see, is password. Even though it did work, you can probably see what is wrong here. Why is there no, say, -username option, -password option, dash name option, dash notes option, all of these things in here, which are part of this JSON object, you shouldn't need to see if you're doing this from a CLI tool. You should just have options that directly let you set those values and not have to worry about the rest. That is why a CLI tool is actually productive to use. If every single application worked like this, no one would ever use a command line. Now, I do sort of understand why it was made like this, not that I like it. It's made like this because it was originally designed around PowerShell, and PowerShell is very heavy on this sort of syntax, even though it is a horrible idea for a command line. Moving on from making a login, because of the way this is structured with this JSON object, even though we can go and generate a password from the command line, it's not exactly an easy process to actually get it inside of this JQ command here. It's generally going to be much easier just to copy and paste it in. So with the BW generate command, we can actually go and generate a password. And this is just generating with the default settings. We can actually go and configure everything as well. So let's go and run this again, but this time with the -U option, L, N, and S. So U is for uppercase, L is for lowercase, N is for numbers, and then S is for special characters. Now it actually makes use of all of those different character sets. And we can also go pass in the -- length option as well to actually set the length of the password we want to generate. So let's say 50, and as we can see, that is now a fairly long password. We don't just have to generate a password, we can also generate a passphrase. However, these options we've looked at previously can't actually be used with that. So let's go and pass in the -P option. This will actually generate a very simple passphrase. I wouldn't recommend ever using something this short, so I'd recommend also passing in the -- words option, and let's set this to, I don't know, 10 words, for example. And that is a much stronger passphrase. And you can also go and modify the separator being used as well. So --sep, can I spell? R-A-T. I'm really bad at spelling, as you can probably tell. Let's set this to be a, I don't know, a plus, for example. Now, one thing that does bother me is we can't actually go and say, I want to swap out the O's for certain characters and the A's for certain characters. We're basically stuck just swapping out the separator. However, if you are using a password manager like BitWarden, it doesn't really make any sense to set all of your passwords to passphrases. Setting it to a really long, randomly generated password is going to be more secure. Now, we can also go and list out what we have in our vault as well. So BW list, and then let's say items. This will just list out all of the items we have inside of our vault. Now, it's not exactly listing it. All it's doing is just dumping the raw JSON into my terminal. There are options like, say, the -- pretty option, which I guess formats it nicely, and also the -- raw option, which I don't think actually does anything because the default output is the raw option. But this is not a way that you should be listing stuff out if you have a list option. This should be attached to something like BW -- raw output. If I have it as a list option, it should be actually listing the things in the database in a way that's actually easy to read. You can list out other things like, say, your folders, collections, organization, things like that. However, in this account, I don't actually have any of those, and it's going to output stuff in basically the same way anyway. And if you do want to filter some items, you can filter by, say, the URL, the folder ID, collection ID, so on and so forth. This one right here actually is kind of useful. So with BitWarden, when you actually delete something, it doesn't get deleted from BitWarden straight away, just in case you accidentally delete something that wasn't supposed to be deleted. So first of all, it's going to be dumped inside of your trash. So passing in the -- trash option will let you actually see what's inside of your trash. And let's go instead pass in the -- search option and then search for, say, item. That will also be filtering down the list, but this time by the name. Really, the only time I would use the list option like this is when I want to get the ID for doing things like deleting and updating. Besides that, though, I wouldn't really ever touch this option. So we can also get a specific item as well. So if we go and take this ID right here and then run BW get and then item pass in the ID, that will just output the information about that one specific object. But obviously doing it like that doesn't really make any sense. So if instead of doing that, we do BW get and then password with the exact same ID, now it's just going to output the password for that login. And you can also get any of the other properties associated with the object as well with any of these values right here. But If you're just getting it for your personal usage and not inside of a script, honestly, it doesn't really make any sense to use anything besides get item, because you can always just find it inside of this JSON object right here. Now, if you have a URL associated with the login, even though when you run bw get and then password, it will complain about not having an ID, you can actually go and pass in the URL instead. So let's go and get rid of that item we made earlier. So bw delete, and then we're going to be deleting an item in this case, not a folder or a collection or anything like that. And then we pass in the ID we had from before, and then it's just going to go and magically put it inside of our trash. So as I said earlier, it won't go and automatically delete it for us, so if you did accidentally run it on the wrong login, it's not a major deal. Back over on the web client, if we go into the bin, as we can see, we have the item name here. This other one here was from when I was testing it before the video. If when you're deleting something, you want it to be a permanent deletion and not a trash deletion, you can also go and pass in the -p option, which will go and do that. The problem with this, though, is that there is no confirmation prompt, so if you accidentally have the -p option in there, you can very well lose your login. However, when something is in the trash, we can go and recover it from the command line. So the first thing we need is the ID of the thing we want to recover. So let's go bw list items --trash, and here are all the things in the trash. So let's go and recover, say, this one right here. So now we go bw restore item, and then the ID. Now, if we go back to the bw list items, as we can see, that item should be in here somewhere, but this is a massive JSON object, so I can't exactly tell. Okay, so I've saved folders to the end, basically because they work in almost the exact same way as creating things like an item. So the first thing we need to do is bw get template, and then get the template for a folder. And as we can see, it's a very simple object this time. So the command we're going to run, while still being fairly ridiculous, is going to be slightly less so. So once again, bw get template folder, pass that into JQ, set the name value to, in this case, we're going to call it my folder. Actually, no, we'll call it my folder 1 because I already had a my folder in there. Then we pass that into bw encode, and then pass that into bw create folder. And that goes and actually makes the folder. And as we can see right here, we have a my folder 1, which is the folder that we just went and made. The exact same logic holds for things like collections and everything else you can make. It's all just as poorly handled. In my honest opinion, in the state that it's currently in, I cannot recommend the BitWarden CLI tool to anyone. Even if you really love JSON, this is just not a convenient tool to work with. If you want a CLI password manager, just go and use something like Pass, and I'm sure there's probably like a CLI interface for some of the others out there as well. I actually did get in contact with the BitWarden team about this, and at least the person running the Twitter account does seem receptive to feedback, so maybe it'll change. Honestly, I would love to see it change to be more like the GitHub CLI tool, where there's options to set everything you want to set, rather than just working with the API directly. Because as it currently stands, working with the BitWarden CLI tool is probably only barely more convenient than trying to work with it directly using something like curl. Maybe you want to make a blog to protest how bad a design BitWarden CLI is. One way you can do that is over on Linode. If it runs on Linux, you can run on Linode. They have the distros you'd expect available, like Ubuntu and Debian, but also Arch and Gentoo, because why not? They've got multiple server plans available, so whether you want to host a blog or a personal VPN, you know there's going to be one that fits you. Going forward, I'll be using Linode to host all of my community game nights. If you need help, Linode has 24/7, 365 support available by phone regardless of your plan size. So right now, you guys can get started on Linode with $100 credit by going to the link on screen or in the description down below. Linode was in the game 3 years before Amazon entered cloud computing, so you know they know their stuff. A huge thank you to Linode for sponsoring the channel. So I think that's going to be basically everything for me. Before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Chris, Joachim, Donald, Michael, Andre, Nathan, David Monzar, Will, Brennan, Chicabento, Jamie, Joseph, Mitchell, Peter D, Stephen, Tony Tushar, and all of my $2 supporters. If you'd like to go support my work, them links down below to my Patreon, subscribe star, LibrePay, all of that sort of stuff. I've got my podcast, Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere, and then this channel is available on Odyssey, Library, and BitChute. If you want to watch my platform, on my platform, if you want to watch my videos, on a platform that isn't YouTube. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.